coming in, if people could just hop in the chat and make sure you're doing it to the group and not just the panelists and hosts, but just in the chat, put the team that you are associated with, which squad you work with, if you're just varsity girls, varsity boys, novice, whatever it is, maybe masters, and what your favorite TV show is, and no pressure, but there are a couple right answers.
But no wrong answers, is that correct?
I don't know that I could say, I don't know that I am experienced enough in pop culture to say there are wrong answers specifically, but there are definitely some right answers. So name, program, squad, and what your favorite TV show is. Good morning, Jody.
All right. Well, Abby, while they go ahead and put those stats in the chat, let's get rolling. Everybody, welcome, and thank you for joining us for this presentation on grit. Abby Young is a varsity women's coach at Sarasota Crew, and I think it will be very obvious as she gets into this, but she's the perfect person to present on this. So Abby, thank you for being here as well. And yeah, go ahead and take it away.
Good. Thank you, Sarah. So before I do get started, I am prompting everybody again, your team, your squad, and then what your favorite TV show is in the chat. And like I said, there are a couple right answers. So this is us. Yes, great. Awesome. Thank you, Kristen. So what your team and squad favorite TV show is in the chat. Like Sarah said, I am the varsity girls coach at Sarasota Crew. I also coach within the U19 national team system. I was an athlete in the system starting in 2008 all the way through 2011. Then was an RA in 2016 and 2017. Coached with the high performance women in 2018, Canamex women in 2019, and then the Canamex in selection development men in 2021. I am this year enrolled in a grad school program. I'm doing a master's degree at the University of Pennsylvania in applied positive psychology. Positive psychology is an awesome field. We think of it as kind of like the flip side of the coin to what we consider to be mainstream psychology, which deals a lot with anxiety, depression, personality disorders, these things that kind of like bring negativity and bring down people's lives. Positive psychology studies and deals with the science of what makes people thrive and how to encourage flourishing in their lives. My favorite TV show currently, unsurprising to some of you, I hope, is Ted Lasso. I'm going to plug it. I'm going to also do a little shout out here to Caitlin McLean, who I know is here. Caitlin can say hi to everybody in the chat, and specifically Caitlin McLean's mom, who suggested to me that I should formulate my presentations around Ted Lasso, which I think would have been so fun. And rewatching this series this past weekend and prepping for this, I realized that clips from Ted Lasso would not maybe be the most appropriate to put into these presentations, but it is an absolutely fantastic show. I highly recommend it for people. I see lots of elements of positive psychology displayed throughout the talk. So we will go ahead and get started here. The plan for today, we're actually going to start with what is not the plan. There are a lot of things that came up that just in the process of prepping this talk that came to mind and other themes and topics and concepts that were popping into my brain that are related to grit that I want to give you guys a list of and resources for because they're awesome topics to pursue and I think really, really applicable to coaching. Talk a little bit about Angela Duckworth, Pete Carroll, top level goals, how grit's defined, psychological characteristics of gritty people being these four things: interest, practice, purpose, and hope as defined by Angela Duckworth. And we're going to talk a little bit at the end about modeling behavior. So getting into what's not the plan, and Sarah is going to pop into the chat a book list for you all that I put together that deals with some of the topics that are listed here. And again, these are just things that came to mind as I was putting this presentation together. Antifragility is the idea that we need challenges in order to thrive. So Greg Lukianoff and John Haidt argue basically that we see a lot of fragility, and especially in adolescents today. And their book, the Coddling of the American Mind, which is on this book list, deals with that concept specifically, how adults have this tendency to coddle children, and it's created this fragility in them. And instead, they argue that in order to thrive, especially in the long run, what we actually need is anti-fragility. Self-determination theory argues that people experience different types of motivation, each of which has different effects on their behavior, perseverance, performance, and psychological wellness. This book, called Self-Determination Theory, Basic Psychological Needs and Motivation Development and Wellness, is on the book list. Self-actualization is the process of actualizing oneself, as in reaching one's potential. Harmonious and obsessive passions are their topics that I am really, really excited to get into. They were recommended to me through an assistant instructor in my grad school program. They describe various relationships we have with passions. Harmonious passions are those that are thought to be intrinsically motivated, integrated with oneself, whereas obsessive passions are related to those that are driven by external compulsion. And we really take a lot of our sense of self-worth and sense of self-esteem from these obsessive passions. Flow is this awesome concept that, and is also the name of a book written by Mihai Csikszentmihalyi. He actually just passed away, world-renowned psychologist who developed the concept of flow, which is this state of effortlessness and almost meditation. He describes it as when your skill level matches the challenge that's put in front of you exactly. So I think of flow specifically almost like a runner's high when you have that kind of feeling, but he describes it in terms of basically any activity that you can perform. Habits, I would recommend that you watch my talk from yesterday. We'll get into habits a little bit. We'll just touch on it later on. Hive psychology is the idea that humans are in part hivish creatures, and that we take after bees, and that we put the collective, we put the hive first. John Haidt again wrote this awesome book called The Righteous Mind, in which he talks about hive psychology. Super applicable to rowing. He was one of our guest lecturers in the fall and actually gave a lot of rowing examples in his lecture. Mattering is a concept that's really tangential to grit, but we'll talk about that a little bit later on. Isaac Prelotensky and his wife, Ora Prelotensky, just published this great book called How People Matter. I've read excerpts from it that are great. Learned hopefulness is the idea that hope can be learned and taught. Martin Seligman and Steve Mayer have done some great research on this, and Martin Seligman has a couple books on this, one of them being Learned Hopefulness, the other being The Hope Circuit. Locus of control is where the control over our lives lives. So it's either considered to be internal, or we consider it to be internal to us or external to us, has a lot to do with mental health and well-being. Goal setting and goal pursuit. We'll talk about this kind of throughout this presentation. Angela Duckworth is again a great resource for these two topics, as well as some self-regulation strategies that deal with and support goal setting and goal pursuit. And then mental contrasting and implementation intentions are some more self-regulation strategies that support goal setting and goal pursuit. Throughout this lecture and at the top of the book list is the book Grit by Angela Duckworth. A lot of this presentation is based on that book specifically. She is the world-renowned psychologist that has studied grit and really developed the concept of it, and is just fantastic. So we will start on this slide. People that know me know that I'm a big fan of football. I think that has something to do with growing up in New England in the late 90s and, well, really all of the 2000s so far. But football in general, I'm a big fan of. I was lucky enough to go to my first NFL game, which was a Seattle Seahawks game, over this holiday break, and had a lot of fun. Angela Duckworth, in her book Grit, actually references Pete Carroll. So she starts in the opening of her book to talk about top level goals. And she states hers as being to use psychological science to help kids thrive, which I loved it. I literally put a heart next to it when I read it in the book. I think that her top level goal relates in some way to why we're all here and doing this conference, whether it's psychological science or physiological science, maybe it's nutrition or whatever. A lot of her top level goal is why we're here, helping kids thrive. Pete Carroll talks about life philosophies, and his is to do things better than they have ever been done before. So Angela Duckworth in Grit references Pete Carroll and talks about this. While Pete Carroll refers to this top level goal as what your life philosophy is, in the world of psychology, psychologists tend to think of top level goals or life philosophies as what one's ultimate concern is. I think of it in a little bit like a mission statement, what above all else helps guide all of your thoughts, actions, and decisions. This image is from the book Grit. For people who are visual learners, I thought it was fantastic. This one top level goal, which is supported by mid-level and low-level goals. And she does say that there can be many, many mid-level goals. Your top level goal, your life philosophy, your ultimate concern, however you define it, is the top of your goal hierarchy and often is the most abstract goal that you have. It is thought to be the end in itself, while all lower level goals at whatever tier, whether they're mid-level toward the top, mid-level toward the bottom, or very low level goals, serve as a means to the end, and the end again being your top level goal. And it's important to note that Angela Duckworth in her book does point out that different goal hierarchies can exist in different realms of life. So whether it's your personal goal hierarchy, professional, academic, etc., but that's important to only have one goal hierarchy in each realm. This top level goal, maintaining this goal, is what Grit is about. It requires grit to maintain it, and probably, in my semi-educated opinion, fosters grit along the way in the process of maintaining it. Compromising or giving up on lower level goals, again, these that are the mid-level and then bottom of this goal hierarchy, does not mean that one is not practicing grit. I think this is where a lot of nuance comes in. We kind of conflate grit with toughness, grit with resilience, these kinds of in the moment things. That's not necessarily what grit is. There's a practical nature, and this is where goal setting and goal pursuit comes in. As skills, as life circumstances, etc., evolve, so too must our lower level goals. It does not make sense to maintain the same goals throughout the course of a pursuit of a top level goal if our skills are developing, if our life circumstances change. Flexibility in those lower level goals does not mean that we are not practicing grit. Angela really, really argues that maintaining our top level goal is where our grit lies. Going on to the definition of grit, this is actually taken from a paper that Duckworth and one of her colleagues in psychology, Chris Peterson, along with Michael Matthews and Dennis Kelly from West Point. They wrote a great paper on grit in 2007. And Angela actually did a great amount of work, a great amount of her research on grit on West Point cadets. So back in 2007, they wrote this paper. It's cited here at the bottom, and say they define grit as perseverance and passion for long-term goals. It entails working strenuously toward challenges, maintaining effort and interest over years, despite failure, adversity, and plateaus in progress. Gritty people approach achievement as a marathon. They use stamina in this marathon, whereas disappointment or boredom signals to others that it's time to change course. The gritty individual stays the course. These are some of the topics we'll kind of talk about it again tangentially, and that book list, what we're not going to cover today, actually has a lot of these concepts that are extrapolated in there. The definition of grit, perseverance, and passion for long-term goals is simple to explain and comprehend, but their extrapolation of it sheds some light on interesting related concepts, like I said, some of which we will get into later today. And Sarah, I am not, oh great, it's just you in the chat. I was gonna say, I'm not monitoring the chat, but I see there are some notifications. Okay, so we're going to move on to psychological characteristics of gritty people and start with interest. Interest is positively correlated with both satisfaction and performance, and that people who are interested in what they do both enjoy it more and perform better at it. I just want to do like very brief statistical refresher. Correlation and causation are not the same thing. So just because you are interested in something does not mean it will cause you to enjoy something more and perform better at it. This is a correlational study that this is based on. We can say, okay, there's probably a little bit of causal relationship, but we cannot assume that that is in fact truthful. So as we're talking about how these concepts are related throughout this presentation, I just want to be sure that everyone understands the difference there. They are correlated to each other. One does not necessarily cause the other. In terms of the stages of cultivating passion, I do just want to go back a little bit and reference the talk and the series of talks that are happening during this conference on supporting the ADM, right? This American development model that is kind of being presented on this weekend. I think a lot of the stages of cultivating passion run in parallel with the development of ADM and athlete development throughout those stages. So I do just people who are keeping that in mind, keep it in the back of your mind as we're talking about this progress through discovery, development, and deepening of passion. I do want to go back a slide just briefly and break it down. In the book Grit, Duckworth does break the psychological, she calls them psychological assets of gritty people. I think that's a great way to put it and think of it too, and references them as relating to passion and perseverance. So we're going to cycle through those. Interest, she argues, is kind of the beginning stages of developing passion. So developing interest is the beginning stage of developing passion. In terms of stages of cultivating passion, is start with discovery. So the discovery of interests and passions necessitates time and exposure to new things. So we learn more about what we're interested in as we grow up. So as we develop, right, the phases of human development, and as we are exposed to more things, and it's kind of obviously gives us the opportunity to find more of what we're interested in, the more and more kind of new ventures that we pursue. From discovery, we move into the phase of development. The development of a passion requires subsequent exposures beyond the initial one to that specific interest that then capture our attention repeatedly. Then the deepening of passion. Our passion deepens with a supportive network of people around us. So Duckworth talks about this specifically, parents, teachers, coaches. This is where we come in. These people provide the stimulation, information, positive feedback, all these things that are necessary to keep us on the hook as our passion starts to deepen. She also points out that novelty is important to both cultivating and maintaining interest. So even beyond this stage and the initial stages of cultivating passion, when we think about what keeps someone interested, what keeps someone passionate in the long run, because again, grit, when we talk about grit specifically, we are thinking through a long run lens. She talks about novelty and has this great quote: for the beginner, novelty is anything that hasn't been encountered before. For the expert, novelty is nuance. So I think about that in terms of both what keeps me invested in rowing and learning about rowing and coaching and all these things. I love talking about the nuance. I was fortunate enough to coach this awesome small boat camp with both Caitlin McLean and Jesse Folia around Thanksgiving. And we had some great conversations, even with the athletes that were there, about different technical nuances. And I left our conversations and I left that camp myself feeling so rejuvenated and like I had learned so much. The kids weren't necessarily keeping up with everything that we were talking about, but certainly all the new concepts that they were exposed to, you could kind of see like their eyes opening and lighting up in that. And I thought the conversations we had both things that they hadn't encountered before and things that to us were more nuanced, were just fantastic for kind of renewing everybody's passion in that moment. Support for cultivating passion. Play is huge. And I think so much about Ted Lasso when I think about play, and the more and more research I do in play and just recognizing the importance of it and the value of it, both in terms of coaching it, incorporating it into practice, but also as adults and how we experience play, has that like rejuvenating and refreshing effect on all of us when it comes to cultivating passion. Play in the beginning stages of developing a passion is crucial for having fun and having that interest develop. In her book, Duckworth has this great quote: "Before hard work comes play." And I would add, during hard work comes play. And I think of the scene in Ted Lasso, those of you who are familiar, again, another plug for it. The scene where Roy Kent, and like before he actually formally, well, I'm going to give it away. Roy Kent takes Isaac McAdoo to a soccer football field and tells him just to get out there and have fun. He was kind of in this rut and was like, you just need to go out there and remind yourself that you do what you love and you need to have fun while you're doing it. And I think about that and the importance of that, not only in initially cultivating an interest and a passion, but also in continuing it. Like it, we need to have fun in coaching. We need to have fun doing what we're doing in order to stay invested and to stay gritty for it. Encouragement is also crucial for the development and deepening of passion. Autonomy and intrinsic motivation, like two topics that I think I put on that initial list, but really, really great tangential topics to this. Autonomy gives beginners the sense of ownership and is correlated a lot with intrinsic motivation, which itself is correlated to greater performance and psychological well-being. I think autonomy and intrinsic motivation also are tied to those concepts of harmonious and obsessive passions, which I would, again, really recommend people look into if you have any interest. In reading this, I was reminded of this paper that we had to read for school, which I thought was so fascinating, on high-level goal control. So William Davis and his colleagues studied the effects of high-level control of academic goals. So that's important. Their research is specific to academic goals, but I think it's got great ties to athletics and life in general. And so they studied the effects of it on goal meaningfulness, motivation, and self-concordance. So high-level goal control involves focusing on the ultimate meaning or purpose of a task. It helps us answer why we're performing a task rather than how, and it brings to light the importance and significance of the specific activity. So if we think in terms of our goal hierarchy, considering a lower level or mid-level goal with a high level control. So asking us that question, okay, what is the ultimate purpose of this? Why am I doing it? And framing those low to mid-level goals in terms of that higher level goal, how it supports our top level goals, is tied to greater self-concordance, greater meaningfulness, and greater motivation. Greater self-concordance is defined in this paper as the extent to which people pursue their set of goals with feelings of intrinsic interest and identity congruence, basically how intrinsically motivated and supportive the goals are of one's self-concept. High-level goal concordance, self-concordance, is itself, like I just said, intrinsically motivating, which keeps people on the hook. It keeps them interested. It actually helps them continue to practice goals, continue to practice habits that are in support of their top level goals, and ultimately is a component of grit, that long-term perseverance and passion that we're looking at here. And then we will... Oh, Sarah put that's a great question in the chat. What ways do you all incorporate play into your practices to develop interest and passion? That's a great question, Sarah. And I would encourage everybody to think about it a little bit. And not only just play into our practices, but frankly, play into our lives. Someone asked my classmates and I this question, my classmates and me this question of how we incorporate play into our lives as adults. And I didn't really have an answer, which then scared me because the research on play is absolutely incredible for what it does for psychological health and well-being. Okay, so that
Yeah.
is interest, cultivating passion at the beginning stages. Now we're going to move on to practice, which Duckworth classifies as an element of perseverance. And specifically deliberate practice. So this guy, Anders Ericsson, he's in this list of researchers to research over here. Duckworth describes him as the world expert on world experts, which I think is like one of the highest forms of praise anyone could ever get. He studies the quality of practice of experts and coined the term deliberate practice. You probably know of him because of his 10,000 hour rule. That rule was popularized by Malcolm Gladwell in his book Outliers. Ericsson is kind of like the father of that 10,000 hour rule, and also the concept of deliberate practice. Duckworth details the process of deliberate practice of experts, starting with setting stretch goals, working toward them relentlessly with attention and effort, pursuing feedback on them, and then repeating that process, either in pursuit of the same stretch goal, so going back to step number one, or in pursuit of a different stretch goal once the preceding goal is accomplished. Values and perspective. When probing about how deliberate practice feels, researchers find that those who practice it describe it as feeling more effortful and less enjoyable than other training mechanisms. But if we consider how deliberate practice builds skills, we may indirectly find pleasure in deliberate practice. So, and Duckworth has this quote, the thrill of getting better, right? That kind of excitement that we feel of, okay, we're improving, right? Like I'm seeing progress. There is a result to the work that I put in. Discussing the pleasure and enjoyment brings us to a conversation about the relationship between deliberate practice and flow. So flow, the concept and the book are on that recommendation list, again, developed by the psychologist Mihai Csikszentmihalyi. Without diving too deep into it, although I do think it is worth a deep dive in your own time, Csikszentmihalyi created and developed the concept of flow, and he describes it as an effortless state during which one is fully engaged in almost a thoughtless way. And like I said earlier, where their skills match their challenge exactly. So if you find that your skills are greater than the challenge in front of you, you will feel a sense of boredom. And if you find that the challenge in front of you is greater than the skills that you have to conquer it, you'll feel a sense of anxiety. And flow is kind of that beautiful equilibrium, the intersection of those two where challenge and skills match. Duckworth describes the relationship between deliberate practice and flow as deliberate practice being for preparation, and flow being for performance. In his book, Csikszentmihalyi describes several benefits to experiencing flow, the feeling of which is arguably addictive, that feeling of runner's high that you feel and wanting to get back into a pursuit of something in order to have that feeling again. We were prompted to write a paper during the fall semester about the relationship between grit and flow, in which I argue that grit is necessary to achieve flow. It's what enables our skills to develop so that they can match progressively harder challenges as our relationship with a certain task, a certain goal, a certain passion, whatever it is, develops. Either way, perspective within deliberate practice matters. It's important to be focused on the process rather than the outcome. We'll talk more about this when we get into the psychological characteristic of hope later on. But if there is one thing that I can say about that, thinking about process rather than thinking about results is crucial in thinking about how we're developing grit and how we're developing specifically the psychological characteristics that support it. Taking from Duckworth's book, taking advantage of deliberate practice, she says, follow the experts, do what they do, set the goal, pursue it, seek feedback and repeat, and focus on the process while you're doing it. Form habits that support deliberate practice. For the sake of time in this session, I'll encourage you all, if you're interested, to watch my talk on habits from yesterday, or even just look at the presentation. There's some information in there on how to both build new habits and break old habits. Changing your experience of deliberate practice has a lot to do with reframing failure. We come back again to the idea of focusing on the process rather than focusing on the outcome. We've got this culture of failure where it's very shameful. And this shame limits our willingness to try new things and take risks. It limits our effort. It prevents us from responding productively to negative feedback, and it misdirects our intention. So in order to take advantage of this deliberate practice and to kind of come back in this resilient and gritty way, it's important to reframe failure as a learning opportunity and to be intentional about that.
Abby, if you don't mind, we have a question that popped up.
Yeah, please.
Would you agree that you can describe flow as active meditation?
That is a great question, and I don't know that I would. I think so. Meditation to me is a deliberate practice, right? I think it's kind of described as we are there to deliberately think and deliberately sit with our thoughts. And the practice of meditation is really the strengthening of our brain, right? To notice when our thoughts wander and to bring them back to that. Flow is not intentional. Flow is thought to be spontaneous. We're not necessarily sitting down and saying, okay, I'm going to put myself in flow right now. Meditation is a little bit different. So I would say that the two are related to each other. I might say that active meditation is a subset of flow, but I don't know that I would describe flow specifically as active meditation. That's a really, really great question though. And again, if Csikszentmihalyi were alive, I think it would be a great question for him. And I'm sure there are amazing researchers that could speak more specifically to this question and the answer. But that's kind of my 2 cents on it. I hope that's helpful.
That's great. Thank you, Abby.
Yeah. All right, so we've covered interest in practice. We're going to move on to purpose, which Duckworth argues contributes to and deepens our passion, especially in the longer term. So again, we're thinking about grit in terms of how it relates to long-term passion and perseverance of goals, and purpose kind of brings us into that longer term. I will say this is hopefully going to stir up some thoughts and opinions in this because of how Duckworth defines purpose. So she says it's the intention to contribute to the well-being of others. I'm happy to have people pop their answer to this in the chat. Do you think purpose ultimately and always relates to other people? I'm still torn on the answer to this myself. I did a lot of thinking on this specific question, specifically like how our well-being, how our happiness, and how our flourishing relates to other people in our lives. And I'm torn about it. Like I said, Chris Peterson and many other psychologists, whether they're positive psychologists or otherwise, argues that people are at the crux and the core of so many things, including happiness, including meaning, including the lack of both of those things, et cetera, that bring these different, like either positive or negative elements into our lives. Chris Peterson has this saying that it's simply that other people matter. And he actually uses that saying to define the entire field of positive psychology. Like I said, I'm still a little bit torn on it. With the deeper I get into the question is, okay, like is purpose specifically related to other people? Is the ultimate meaning of, ultimately for me personally, I think it is. I thrive off of wanting to help other people. I think my personal top level goal is incredibly related to Angela Duckworth's. I love helping kids. Like that is why I do what I do. I love mentoring kids. I love coaching them. So I think ultimately that is my purpose, my top level goal, but I'm curious to hear what other people say about that. whatever your opinion on it is, I think Duckworth's argument can at least bring light to the idea that the collective matters, right? How we coach culture matters. How we treat teammates matters. How our athletes approach culture, how our athletes approach their teammates. It all matters. In terms of other people and happiness, John Haidt has a great book called The Happiness Hypothesis, and he talks a lot about relationships with other people. Emily Esfahani Smith has a book out called The Power of Meaning. That's another great book that has to do with relationships of other people. Development of purpose. So this is going back into Duckworth's book, and she talks about strategies that different psychologists put forward in order to develop purpose. Bill Damon specifically is a psychologist. I think he's out of Stanford, argues that purpose can and should be developed deliberately. So he argues that, and purpose being this, as Duckworth calls it, this beyond the self orientation, right? This tie and this relation to other people and cultivating the well-being of other people. Damon argues that the development of this perspective, of this purpose, starts with interest. In a way, Duckworth does the same thing as she frames interest as the precursor to purpose within this realm of passion. Damon then argues that the next step is having a model of purpose, someone who actively demonstrates it's possible to achieve something with others in mind. I think about us specifically as coaches. Third comes the ability to recognize a problem. So there's someone or many someones somewhere that have a problem that needs to be solved. And lastly comes the belief that they can affect change in relation to this problem. So this belief specifically is called self-efficacy. Self-efficacy is the belief that one can impact the world around them. And it relates tangentially to concepts like locus of control, learned hopefulness, self-determination theory, as I listed on one of the opening slides. James Maddox and Evan Kleiman, that are listed in this research list on the right, argue that modeling of purpose in phase 2, as described by Duckworth and Damon, supports the development of self-efficacy through a strategy called vicarious efficacy. So this idea that I can learn that I am capable of doing something by watching somebody else do it. Personally, like, I don't love extreme adrenaline things. Like, I didn't really love roller coasters. I don't love the idea of bungee jumping, these types of things. But I think about what would comfort me in the moment before approaching these types of things would be watching somebody else do it. That kind of element of like, okay, well, if that person can do it, I can do it too. That is vicarious efficacy. So in talking about this modeling of purpose, and as I mentioned earlier, we're going to talk about modeling behavior a little bit later on, is this strategy called vicarious efficacy, in which we learn that we are capable of doing something because somebody else is. I would argue too that in addition to impacting purpose and therefore passion, self-efficacy also directly impacts the later stages of interest as well as practice, and directly relates to hope, which we'll discuss next. Self-efficacy is a huge concept that within the study of positive psychology, I keep coming back to when I think about adolescents today, and when I think about mentoring and coaching kids today. I keep coming back to this concept of self-efficacy and teaching kids to be efficacious responsibly. Moving on, so David Yeager is another psychologist and researcher that Duckworth mentions, and he argues that reflection on how what we're already doing impacts other people contributes to the development of purpose. Like literally looking at the practices that we have, the behaviors that we have today, and thinking about how they already impact other people intentionally or otherwise can help us cultivate purpose almost retroactively, right? Without intention, just reframing how what we're doing affects other people. Amy Resnesky and her colleagues, Jane Dutton. Dutton is known for her work on high quality connections. As someone, if anyone here is interested in workplace culture, Jane Dutton is a great person to look into. So Jane Dutton, Justin Berg, and Adam Grant, who is a world-renowned organizational psychologist. You might follow him on Instagram or LinkedIn or something like that. He's just got these like really, really great insights and easily digestible one-liners that they post are really thought-provoking. They as a team developed the intervention of job crafting, in which participants are asked to consider how they can change their current work environment in small but impactful ways to better align with their core values. Core values, obviously, in kids, in terms of developing grit, right? They might not have a great sense of what their core values are just yet, but I think we can adopt the same intervention to apply to how we can craft our job environment, our practice environment, to better support others and or our overarching purpose, our top level goal. So we've covered these three things so far: interest and purpose within the overall category of passion and perseverance. Brings us to the last psychological characteristic of gritty people, as defined by Duckworth, hope. This is probably my favorite of the four, and hopefully you'll see why. I think there is so much teaching and learning that's possible here that people don't really realize. Duckworth has this great quote: "The hope that gritty people have has nothing to do with luck and everything to do with getting up again." And that kind of like get knocked down 7 times, get up 8, it comes in and plays in like right with that saying. I'm going to come back and this, I want to talk about this researchers to research list right now. I cannot put any more plugs in for Martin Seligman. He has written so many great books about optimism, including The Optimistic Child. He wrote that book, Learned Hopefulness. He's got that book, The Hope Circuit. He is the father of positive psychology and basically has spent his life dedicated to the science of how to make people's lives better. He considers himself to be pessimistic. I would say his work is inherently optimistic, but is a really, really fantastic person to look into. He is about to turn 80 years old, and he is writing his next book on human agency, which I think is going to stir up a lot of debate across different research fields, but give rise to hundreds of further research questions. And I think agency, and as he defines it, I'm not going to give anything away. I'll tell everybody to read the book, but agency, as he defines it, is tied really, really strongly to self-efficacy. Again, which I come back to as being huge in developing well-being and teaching athletes, young athletes, how to be gritty, how to have psychologically healthy lives, and have grit. So Duckworth, coming back to her book, has found that gritty people explain events optimistically. So there is this concept as defined by Martin Seligman and detailed in his book, Learned Optimism, called explanatory style. Explanatory style is how you explain to yourself, so the habits that you have of explaining to yourself negative events. Its explanatory style is broken into 3 different elements: permanence, which is if you describe a negative event as something that's temporary or something that's permanent. Optimists define negative events as temporary. Pessimists tend to define them as permanent. Pervasiveness is how you describe in terms of specificity versus generality. So optimists say, okay, this negative event is specific to this one situation. Pessimists tend to define negative events as being general, like they're going to apply to everything in their lives. So I gave the example to my athletes of, okay, having a pessimistic, pervasive explanatory style is basically saying, I failed my chem test in school today. I'm not going to do well on our erg workout this afternoon, even though we know that those 2 things are not related. Pessimists will recognize that they're not, right? They'll have that specific attribution to that negative event. Pessimists will not, right? They will say, okay, this one negative thing is going to affect everything else. Personalization of explanatory style is saying, well, if a negative event is my fault versus if it's a chance event, right? Like if it happens without my doing, I didn't cause something. There's a big nuance here, and I think about this a lot. The example I gave was, okay, if we go out and we have a bad row, right? If we're out and we've got 4/8 across and one boat has a really terrible row, someone is saying, like, if you're sitting there saying that entire thing is my fault, that's a pessimistic explanatory style in terms of personalization. If you're sitting there and saying it's everybody else's fault or it's this one other person's fault, that is considered, as defined by Seligman, more optimistic, but I actually think there's a moral element that doesn't really jive with me too well. So I think there's a nuance to that, and a responsibility that comes with that personalization of understanding that while you're not necessarily placing the blame on yourself, and I'll caveat this by saying I think blame and responsibility are two different framings of the same idea. Blaming yourself is not the same as taking responsibility for it, right? Like, again, one is probably more optimistic and pessimistic, but I do think there's some big nuances there. And then growth mindset. A lot of you are probably familiar with the concept of growth mindset, and Carol Dweck's work on this. Growth mindset basically is the mindset that you can learn to do better. And ultimately this mindset itself is hopeful, right? It is optimistic in itself. Duckworth has found that growth mindset is grittier. Like, people who are grittier have more of a growth mindset than fixed mindset. Our mindset specifically, again, it can be changed. Like, that's the great thing about all of these elements is the psychological characteristics, the interest, the purpose, the practice, the hope. We can control all of these things within a certain extent, but we have power to change them. Growth mindset, our mindset in general, is impacted greatly by our relationship to successes and failures in our past and how others react to them. So I relate this back to purpose, the idea that other people matter. We can impact the mindset of other people. Understanding that we, even as coaches, right, as peers, as friends, as spouses, at whatever it is, we can impact the mindset of other people. If we react to something and think of it as we react to a negative event, or we react to a challenge in a negative way, in a discouraging way, it's actually teaching other people to have a fixed mindset. Fostering a growth mindset, we can change our language around it for sure, absolutely. But we come back to this idea of modeling. If we model a growth mindset, Dweck has found that children whose parents react to mistakes and challenges, like I was just saying, in a way that makes challenges seem like they're problematic, rather than, and again, coming back to this idea of the process, rather than opportunities for learning and growth, develop fixed mindsets. Change your language in the wake of mistakes, change your behavior in the wake of mistakes. We'll talk a little bit more about modeling later. And I want to bring attention specifically to this one example that really provoked some thought of mine. In the book Grit, Duckworth talks about a conversation she had with Bill McNabb, who's the current CEO of Vanguard. Bill is a former rower himself, and he talks about having limited opportunities as an athlete. He has this quote: "The coach had a fixed mindset. He just couldn't believe that I'd improved as much as I did." By not having a growth mindset ourselves as coaches, we are not only not modeling it for our athletes, but also potentially robbing them of opportunities. So understanding that we are teachers of growth mindset in the way that we model it. If we don't model it, we are not teaching it to them. We are not teaching them how to be hopeful. And therefore, we are not teaching them one of the, probably the most critical element of grit. Modeling that behavior, modeling growth mindset is crucial. An overarching note on hope: it affects each of the other three psychological characteristics: interest, practice, purpose. This idea that I can get better, I will get better, right? Tying to self-efficacy. I can help other people too, to make their lives better. These things are inherently hopeful. They are inherently optimistic. Hope is strongly tied to future mindedness through optimism and growth mindset, which helps us so greatly with perseverance, right? We think about hope, we think about optimism, we think about growth mindset. They are future minded, right? We are taking into consideration that we can improve for the future. This really, really helps support this concept of perseverance. We went through these 4 things: interest, practice, purpose, and hope. And just lastly, before we do any questions, comments, and discussion, I do want to talk about this idea of modeling behavior. Duckworth talks about it like in these specific instances in her book. But at the beginning of this academic year, a classmate of mine who is a mother herself, she's got 2 or 3 teenagers, made a comment about modeling struggle for kids and specifically as parents and adults in kids' lives, how important it is to model struggle for them so that they can understand everybody has struggles that they deal with. And then how do we overcome those struggles? I think it's really important as coaches to recognize that modeling behavior, as we talked about with purpose and vicarious efficacy and these other things, is crucial in the process of teaching kids various skills. Think about modeling these psychological characteristics of grit, interest, practice, purpose, and hope. Think about modeling struggle. Think about modeling growth mindset, as we just talked on. I just wanted to shed light on this very, very basic list of things related to this discussion that we can model for kids, both to help them teach these skills specifically and to help create a culture that embodies and supports them. That is what I have for you guys. If we want to go into comments and questions and discussions and other things like that. And
perfect. Yeah, Abby, we have about 6 minutes left. We got a lot of comments about hope and how people use that in their coaching philosophy. And I think that that's such, in my personal opinion, I feel like, pushing to failure or allowing space for failure has become a really kind of hot topic because this word failure, right, has so much negativity with it. And I feel like so much of what you just explained and spoke about is putting responsibility on the coach to create a safe enough space for these athletes to feel comfortable pushing to that level. Could you talk about either instances for you as an athlete where you felt moments where you could, you were impacted by a coach and you felt comfortable enough to push, or ways that you now as a coach create those spaces?
Yeah, sure. I think that's a really great question, Sarah. I think back to my career as an athlete and specifically how like learning happens in both the positive and the negative, right? And thinking, okay, like learning as an athlete without knowing, I never thought I was going to go into coaching. Like I had no idea that this was like part of what my journey was going to have through life. But I think back on it and have realized throughout pursuing positive psychology and even throughout pursuing coaching that I have models of both good coaching and bad coaching, right? And like, I will give a huge shout out to Sandy Armstrong, who I hope is still on this call, probably the most positive and best coach I had. And when I say probably, I mean, like seriously, like if I said definitely, she's going to sit there and be horrified. She's probably shaking her head and laughing. Was so wonderful at creating that like non-judgmental space of just try it, right? Like take the risk and see what happens. And when it goes well, I'm going to like respond in a really, really encouraging way. And when it doesn't go well, we're just going to try something new, because if it doesn't go well, it doesn't go well. I had coaches that on the complete opposite end of that were so destructive, like even in unnecessary moments that were not even like we were doing anything wrong, just really condescending and judgmental. And I think now to like the environment that kids live in, like in terms of social media and school and their pressure to perform and all these kinds of like rankings of their GPA and their 2K score and all these things, and really want them to realize that like there is a process behind those numbers. There's a process behind those results that requires failure, right? Like I'm going to go all the way back to the beginning of this talk and this idea of anti-fragility. Like we need adversity to thrive. We need these types of experiences to be the best people, athletes, friends, colleagues, students, whatever it is. We need them in our lives. So I look at it and think, I try to always find something positive, right? Like it doesn't, we do, similar erg workouts in our training plan frequently. And we talk as a team about like, okay, the value is not just like who PRs on this workout, right? It's okay, did you negative split, or is your split delta less than it was last week, right? Like, what was your mental approach? Were you talking to yourself more positively than you were last week, and finding those instances and specific examples of finding positivity, right? Like finding that growth. Okay, what did we do a little bit better? Even if we did everything else worse, chances are there is something we did a little bit better than the last time we did it. So taking advantage, and I wouldn't say it's like this massive overhaul of a culture. It happens in the small moments, right? It's that kind, the culture is developed in those small moments. And that's really what I try to focus on, is the natural integration of these things rather than a massive overhaul of the culture that's around us.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I something that really resonated, and that was also brought up in responses in the chat, is that a pessimist considers, a bad day something more permanent, and it is more impactful, rather than an optimist, whether it's an athlete, a coach, a non-athletically related event. They see it as a growth opportunity. And I think that is just I love this topic because it's such a life topic. It's certainly not an athlete related or
No.
centric idea.
Right. That's what I love about this, right? Is like,
Yes.
we're coaching rowing, but we're really teaching life through rowing. And like, that's
Totally.
what I love. And I'll say to the kids, like, this is a life lesson. This isn't a rowing lesson, right? Like perk your ears up a little bit, because it does matter the way that it's become kind of a joke on the team. There's a quote in Seligman's book, Learned Optimism, that's like, what matters is what you say to yourself when you fail. And I stood in front of the kids and said that to them over and over one day, and they'll just come up to me and say, what matters is what we say to ourselves when we fail. And I'm like, yes, you're right. And it was a joke to start, but they take it seriously now, right? And I'm starting to see these kinds of like I'm finding the positive, right? Like I'm finding the resilience, I'm finding these things in it, which is really, really exciting.
Yes, absolutely. And actually, another thing that was brought up by one of our attendees, and we'll make this the last minute question or comment, but Jody says that they do a mini retrospective at the end of practice. They say one thing they learned, one thing that they didn't do well, and something that they could improve on in the future. And I think that hits on, taking ownership of what is going on, not shying away from criticism, and understanding again that that's a growth opportunity that you can work on for your future self. But then also addressing what is something that is positive. So you kind of hit on all of those levels. So Jody, I think that's pretty awesome. That's a really good habit.
And I will, oh, Amy, you're welcome. I'm glad you could join us. I will say, Sarah, that the later sections of Angela Duckworth's book, she talks about parenting for grit. And I myself am not a parent, but I think there's just so much overlap, right? Like, but you're just working with kids, and in the parenting session, she talks, and I can't remember if it's like psychologically responsible or something like that, but talks about parents that are both demanding and supportive. That's kind of where we want to be, right? Like you want to demand this effort and this attention, this interest, all these types of things. You want to demand that of these kids, but you also want to be really supportive in the process. And so Jody, that reminds me a lot of your mini retrospective, this kind of like taking responsibility, as you said, Sarah, one thing you did well, one thing you learned, and things you can improve on. Is like, yeah, I'm going to put this challenge in front of you, and then I'm going to be supportive through your process of retrospectively learning from it, right? Talking through it and kind of developing a sense of knowledge and awareness and purpose about why we're doing these things. So I think that's great. Jody, thank you for sharing that with everybody.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's actually a perfect, I don't know if we can say it's a period to this topic, but maybe a semicolon.
Exclamation point, hopefully, for today.
Exactly. Well, Abby, thank you. And thank you for sharing on this topic. I'm sure we'll be hearing more about this topic from you likely in the future. And yes, thank you for sharing your contact. Everyone, if you need to reach out to Abby, I know she would love to continue chatting. And I hope you all have a great rest of your Sunday at the conference. Abby, hopefully you get a little rest and get to listen for some.
No, I'm looking forward to the ADM talks, Caitlin and Eric this afternoon. I can't wait.
Yes. Yes. All right. Well, thank you, everyone, and we will see you again soon.